Great. Good evening. I'm David Page, Director of Whitehead Institute, and I'd like to welcome each and everyone here to the first Whitehead Connects of this academic year. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Whitehead Connects is our signature speaker series. Whitehead Connects brings renowned industry leaders to Whitehead Institute to share lessons learned during distinguished careers. So today, it is our honor to welcome Richard Foster, Dick, to Whitehead Institute to share personal insights. The range and depth of Dr. Foster's contributions and accomplishments is extraordinary. I will touch upon just a few scattered points. So, Dr. Foster originally trained as an engineer at Yale, receiving there his bachelor's, his master's, and his doctorate. Skipping to today, Dr. Foster is an emeritus director at McKinsey and a member of the executive committee of the Keck Foundation. This is a foundation that Whitehead feels a particular debt of gratitude to because the Keck Foundation has helped Whitehead in a number of ways. A generous gift from the foundation established the Keck Imaging Facility that is used by virtually all scientists in this building. And another gift from the Keck Foundation promoted the careers of two of our faculty who were recipients of the prestigious Keck Foundation's Distinguished Young Scholars Award. Dr. Foster is also a member of the board of directors at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and he's a member of and lecturer for the China Thinkers Bureau. In addition, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also the best-selling author of the books Innovation, The Attacker's Advantage, and Creative Destruction. So we're thrilled to hear his thoughts, and so without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Foster.
Thank you very much, David. How do I advance the slides? Yes, this one? Okay, I'll try that one. Fantastic. Super, thank you. I'll try this one. When I mentioned to someone that I was coming here, and they said, "What are you going to talk about?" I said, "I'm going to talk about the history of the concept of creativity." They said, "Are you nuts? Are you going to the Whitehead and talking to them about creativity? I mean, they should talk to you about creativity." And I agree with that. So I do this with all humility. I will take a historical approach, which, if I look around the room correctly, my perspective goes back several thousand years, and I don't see anyone here that was alive at the time that this story starts. So hopefully there will be some things in here that will give you a new perspective. So the title is The History of the Concept of Creativity. Where did we get this idea from, and how did it evolve over time? I will tell you that, to your relief, it's going to be a relatively brief history of the concept, and it's going to be a mostly Western history. That's not because I haven't tried to understand the history of the concept of creativity in Asia. I've spent a lot of time trying to do that. It's just very hard to figure it out. And people have tried to do it. I'm happy to discuss it with you all afterwards, and you'll see some aspects of that in the talk. What do we mean by creativity? The first question, which I hope you'll have some insight to, at least what I think it's all about as we go through this. And I think of it as the magic of the near possible. It's not the infinitely far away, but it's something that's near. You can almost feel it, you can almost grab it, but it's not quite there. Can I do it? And how can I do it better? I think those are some of the questions that I plan to address in this hopefully short address. If you finish listening to this speech before I finish giving this speech, please head someplace else. I'll also tell you what this talk is not about, and this is what it's not about. This is not about kludgy things that just, can be pasted together for no apparent reason. I'm going to go back fairly far because I think creativity does go back as far as the human experience and maybe the hominin experience, as a matter of fact. And I'll put you out of any misery that you happen to be in by giving you my definition of creativity right up front here, and then we can talk about it and argue about it later on, and I'll come back to this definition. But my definition is to associate previously unassociated fields. It's a cognitive activity that when we match something that no one else has matched before, then we've had a creative idea. It's different from innovation, which in my mind is making something new, and it's different from entrepreneurship, which is undertaking risk. Entreprendre, the French word to undertake, undertaking risk. So, but creativity is the headwaters, and so that's why I'm focused on that. Its creative expression, I think, can go all the way back. In 77,000 BC, in the Blambos cave, they were building bedding out of mosquito-resistant plants that they had found. That's a pretty smart idea in 77,000 BC. There's flutes from just at the end of the Neanderthal time from Germany, and cave paintings from El Castillo, Spain, which you know. The more recent birth of creativity, but not by much, comes from Hohenstein-Stadel in Germany, where it was found in this cave, and this is the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel. It is a combination, previously unassociated concepts, the head of a lion and the body of a man. Now, what was that all about? One can argue whether this was a useful creative act or not, but my guess is it was a religious object and therefore did have utility in that regard. And it's from 40,000 BC. There's utilitarian innovation appeared, as far as I can figure out the history, about 3,300 years ago. The wheel, which came from trees, which triggered just an enormous cascade of innovations for thousands of years after that, including the chariot and maybe wide-scale war at the time. The stirrup, which itself was a wild innovation at the time, allowed one to ride horses and enter even into more war. There were many other aspects of very creative products that were produced during those periods of time, 3000 BC. And it's estimated world population at that time was around 50 million people. So there's not many, there weren't many people in the world at that time. Depending on whether you believe the Kurgan hypothesis or not, populations spread out from basically the area between the Black and the Caspian Seas over time, and they took innovation with it. And one of those innovations came in 2400 BC, which was the first bond. As far as I know, this is the first bond. So you can maybe argue that entrepreneurship started in 2400 BC. These were bonds denominated in units of grain. And then we had further innovations in creative acts with Gilgamesh, the great story from about 2500 BC. And then we had Homer, who was a creator of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and that was an incredibly creative story. Not everyone in the world was convinced that creativity was the most important thing. If you look on the Chinese side of things, the I Ching, which was about 1000 BC, talked about observing patterns in the world, which was different than associating previously unassociated ideas. And we'll see that idea emerge in China as well. But in other places in that Near East, there was wildly creative activities taking place in 700 BC. This is a Scythian belt buckle that you see. It's unlikely that these two animals existed in this relationship and that they were able to be manifest in gold at the time, but it was really quite a wonderful act. To me, it was an act of creation. Then we have this fellow. This is one of several possible pictures of him. No one took a Polaroid of him. I had to say that word in this neighborhood. And in 500 BC. But it was interesting that Confucius himself said that he was a transmitter who invented nothing. He who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool, shun him. He who knows not, I'm having trouble reading this. He who knows not that he knows is asleep, wake him. He who knows not and knows he knows not is a child, teach him. He who knows and knows he knows is wise, follow him. So this is not quite creativity, but it's building to it. In Greece, we had the muses that were talked about triggering associations, which is associating previously unassociated fields. They were the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. They were common in Greek, Roman, and Indian cultures at the time, and they inspired creation and song. So a notion of creating things goes way, way back. Here's another piece that I happen to like very much from 400 BC. I think it's a marvelously creative piece of artwork. The creativity spirit followed the migration of peoples in Europe. Here's another one that I particularly like, which in my mind is absolutely a creative piece of art. So it may be surprising then that in Greece, in 540 BC, Parmenides came along. And Parmenides said, actually, all this business about change, it isn't true. In the Eleatic school of philosophy, he said, the way of truth is that change is impossible. Existence is timeless, uniform, and unchanging. So this is our Greek heritage. The way of opinions, one century's facilities lead to conceptions which are false and deceitful. So if you think things are changing, you're wrong, right? So that was, he had a pretty compact philosophy there. Importantly, he was a very great influence on Plato, who said that what is it that can properly be called true or false? What is the nature of definition? What is the nature of the connection between the assumptions and its conclusions? He wanted to expel the poets from the world because he thought it was all nonsense. So he said, will we say of a painter that he makes something? Certainly not, he merely imitates. So this is part of the Greek heritage, which we often don't talk about. So it's a little bit of a different view than we've seen for the several thousand years before then. And of course, then he went on Aristotle. Interestingly, Aristotle, of course, opened up a period of time in Greece, which was very creative in my mind, and particularly with this fellow, Archimedes, who used the famous word eureka in 200 BC. So he had come back a little bit from Parmenides. And I mark that as the discovery of discovery, at least in the Western world. Hellenistic creativity was huge at the time. You may know this. This is the Antikythera mechanism, which was a navigation device in the BC period. It's an incredibly intricately made, sophisticated analysis of the stars used for navigation. This is very sophisticated material, and this was around 150 BC. So I think maybe this peaked around the 15th and 16th century. Certainly it's impossible to look at Leonardo and not say that he is the essence of the creative man, but it was true for Michelangelo as well. Machiavelli, maybe a little bit more contentious, but I think he was a very creative fellow as well, and of course Shakespeare. In addition, we had a catalytic event called the printing press, which then triggered lots of people, the ability to be creative for lots of people. And with that, the language started to change. The word science is a 14th century word, according to Webster's anyway. Create is another 14th century word. Innovation is a 15th century word. Scientific is 16th century word. Creative is creative, not creativity, but creative is a 17th century word, and disrupt is an 18th century word. So the language began to change, reflecting this interest in creativity. It was happening as well in China, but I think it's fair to say in a narrower sense. This is Li Shizhen, who was a physician, a pharmacologist, and an herbalist and an acupuncturist, and made huge advances in traditional Chinese medicine, and that was in the 16th century. So it was happening to some extent, but as far as I can tell, and I would be happy to be informed by any of you, there was no Leonardo equivalent in China. That's quite a statement to make. I've tried like mad to find someone that the Chinese would say is Leonardo, but I haven't been successful yet. So I'm happy to take any contributions you all have to make after this. There was a large school, largely centered around the church, that said that things really shouldn't be creative. For the Jesuits, the purpose of mathematics was to construct the world as a fixed and eternally unchanging place. So this is several hundred years after we said that everything is changing, in which order and hierarchy could never be challenged. So there were cross currents here going on in the 17th century. There were people who were quite interested in all the creative acts of the world, and in fact, there were so-called cabinets of curiosities that were quite popular in the 16th and 17th century, which was, in my view, kind of a very large wastepaper basket for things that people had found around the world and didn't really know what to do with them, so they put them in these cabinets of curiosities. But they were used to stimulate the imagination. Scientific networks were founded in the 17th century, with the Royal Society being the leading advocate. And then it all began to accelerate in the 18th century. There was a book written by John Brewer called The Pleasures of Imagination, and he talked about creativity. He talked about creation in this book. And William Duff came up with the theory of genius in the 17th century: imagination, taste, and judgment, rather than divine inspiration. I think the real watershed moment was actually Waterloo in 1815. And the period between 1815 and Sarajevo in 1914 was the calmest period in the history of Europe for a very long period of time. It also coincided with a period of enormous explosion in what we think of as science and technology today. As the pace of war slowed, the pattern began to emerge. We had de Maupassant talking about the short story, which was really a serialized newspaper exercise. Verdi and Wagner were having their battles in writing at the time. Bruckner, Mahler, Sibelius were also writing in music. Gall explained where speech comes from in the brain. Niepce created the first permanent photographic image. Darwin described evolution. Maxwell explained electromagnetism. Cauchy developed number theory, and Freud defined psychoanalysis. It was an amazing 100 years, and it just exploded at that time. And it was in that period of time when the word creativity was actually made it into Webster's. And the year that it made it into Webster's was 1875. Creativity is a very modern word, actually. Creation goes back a long way, and some of these, as we've documented, hopefully. But the word creativity is a very modern word. And as I said earlier, is to associate previously unassociated fields. I have to watch my time here. The creative act, by connecting previously unrelated dimensions of experience, enables the person to attain a higher level of mental evolution. It is an act of liberation, the defeat of habit by originality, as Arthur Koestler, the great novelist, Hungarian English novelist, said in the 60s. So if it's about associating previously unassociated fields, then it can get to be a complicated business, and it sometimes takes a lot of tries. The first person to really understand this from a psychological point of view, as far as I can tell, was William James. And he said, instead of thoughts of concrete things patiently following one another in a beaten track of habitual suggestion, we have the most abrupt crosscuts and transitions from one idea to another, rarefied abstractions and discriminations, unheard of combinations of elements and subtlest associations of analogies. In a word, we seem suddenly introduced into a seething cauldron of ideas where everything is fizzling and bobbling about in a state of bewildering activity, where partnerships can be joined and loosened in an instant, treadmill routine is unknown, and the unexpected seems the only law. This is as good a definition of creativity as I've ever seen. And this goes back 100 years and up about 10 blocks. It's going to be a challenge. Thank you, though. So it's about mastering the arts of the near possible. Whoever said, I need a laser? That wasn't the sentence that came out. Who said, I need a drone? That really didn't come out. Who said, I need latent Dirichlet algorithms, for those of you who are into some forms of AI? Who said, I need an iPhone, actually, now that I come to think of it? These are all things that weren't designed by looking at market needs and coming up with a solution. They came out of the creative instinct. Mastering the arts of the near possible. This is a picture I happen to like because sometimes it goes back in the other way. Bertrand Russell said, the greatest challenge to any thinker is stating the problem in a way that will allow its solution. And I think that's very insightful. Vladimir Nabokov said, genius is in finding the invisible link between things. I think that's also very useful. And he talked about the phases of inspiration, the prefatory glow, the tickly well-feeling that banishes awareness of physical discomfort, feeling of what is going to tell, instant vision that turns into rapid speech, a tumble of merging words forming the nucleus of a work which will grow over months or over years. I think Nabokov was incredibly insightful. As you know, he was a lepidopterist as well as a great author. In the late 19th, early 20th century, two scientists, one German, one French, basically asked the same question: why am I such a productive fellow? And one of them was Hermann von Helmholtz, and the other was Henri Poincaré. And they both tried to describe the phases of the creative process. And their work was summarized by Graham Wallas, who was a member of the Fabian Society in Britain in the early 20th century, the Fabians being a forerunner of the Communist Party in Britain, actually. And Wallas wrote an elegant book called The Art of Thought, 1926. You can buy copies of this now original copies sell for $3,400. You can buy used ones for $1 on the internet. And he talked about three basic stages: preparation, incubation, and elimination. So, and that's still pretty much true. It isn't just a flash. There's a preparation stage, there's an incubation stage, which we'll talk very briefly about, and then illumination. Jung talked about the role of the subconscious, dreams, free associations, integrating opposites, extroversion and introversion. Those are common elements that are all part of this creative process. Arthur Koestler, who wrote, to me, the most knowledgeable book about creativity, The Act of Creation, in 1963, talked about bisociation and putting different ideas together. And he wrote in this regard about three examples. He talked about humor, he talked about literature, and he talked about the scientist. And these he saw as basically essentially the same kinds of fields. Another example of a person that I think of as quite creative is the current day artist, Alice Aycock. Maybe some of you know her. Alice is fascinated with nonlinear differential equations. And she thinks about these things all the time. And out of that, she produces this. And this was on Park Avenue in New York a couple of years ago. It's a highly nonlinear equation. This is another one. This is another one. I think they're amazing things, all because of this associating previously unassociated fields. Marcel Duchamp said, art making is making the invisible visible. I think that's also part of it. And so does Jean Planza, who has made a career out of making the invisible visible. This is one. Can you see the head in this picture? This is totally made as a wire construction, which is quite wonderful, I think. Another guy is Santiago Calatrava. He is fascinated by a lot of scientific things. He's fascinated by skeletons. He's fascinated by bugs. He's fascinated by bugs' wings. He's fascinated by bugs' eyes. He's fascinated by damped nonlinear equations. This is not the stuff of architects, but what does he do with that? He designs this, the St. Louis Symphony, and this, which is an airport, and this, which is a ceiling, and this, which looks like some sort of attack bug, but is a museum, and this is definitely a warrior bug here. And talking about these nonlinear damped equations, there's a building, which is a library that he's designed out of things, associating previously unassociated fields. It starts with curiosity, ubiquitous interest, abstraction ability, exploring the boundaries, assumptions, implications, flaws, openness, love of ambiguity, a certain immaturity. All these are the traits of the creative person. Einstein talked about wonder. Whoever is devoid of the capacity to wonder, whoever remains unmoved, whoever cannot contemplate or know the deep shudder of the soul of entertainment might just as well be dead. The deep shudder of the soul of enchantment. I mean, that's an incredible phrase, I think. Then just Walter Cannon, who was the first chairman of physiology at Harvard, said, hunches are really important to all of this. Hunches were important to these associative abilities. Hunches are built on instinctive framework building, psychologically androgynous people, extroverted and introverted at the same time, aggressive and nurturing, sensitive and rigid, dominant and submissive, conservative yet risk-seeking, humble and proud, and a sense of sunny pessimism. That can be a real pain in the neck to get along with. It can be a slow process to find the near possible, delayed commitment to hypotheses, suspended disbelief for hours or days, and one has to listen carefully to small voices that who knows where they're going to come from. Clues that it's possible, ambiguities, illusions, paradoxes, dilemmas, riddles and puzzles, conundrums, enigmas. We think of these as getting in the way of problem solving. They're at the headwaters of problem solving. That's where all of it starts up there, and fallacies. You have to be able to zoom out to see the whole picture. AI is making this a lot easier for us to see the context. Marshall McLuhan, you may recall, said, "I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish." I think that's true. It's very hard to determine context at some point. You've got to zoom out to see the context, to discover the unknown ontologies that are implicitly out there in our world today. And discovery of ontologies, I think, is one of the great challenges and opportunities of our times. Claude Levi-Strauss and a fellow that many of you may know, John Seeley Brown, who ran Xerox Palo Alto Research for a long time, talked about bricolage. Bricolage is bringing together disparate elements into a synthetic whole. It's the associative connections. And I think of them, if each one of these little A's is an association, and as we sleep and we wake up in the morning and in those early hours, we think about new associations, and it's not just an individual association, it's where they fit in the framework of associations, until all of a sudden you have a full structure, and that becomes a great idea. And it's the construction of these associative networks that makes a difference. Illustration, this is Florence in the 15th century. Right in the middle, you'll see the big dome, which is called Brunelleschi's dome. And Filippo Brunelleschi designed this in the 15th century. It's still the largest dome, I believe, in the Western world. I think it's larger than the Hagia Sophia. And who designed Brunelleschi's dome? Well, as Mike Csikszentmihalyi said, who was at Chicago at the time, nor can one say it's the creative person who starts the creative process. In reality, they were only catalysts for a much more complex process with many participants and many inputs. So he had the idea of the dome, but how could he build that dome? Well, he picked up the herringbone patterns of construction from Roman roads, and he also talked about the Pantheon and its design of increasingly lighter concrete as it went to the top. Those are the things he brought together. Those are the associations he made in order to allow him to design still the greatest dome in the world. So the construction of associative networks. Here's another associative network. It was started with the notion of the World Wide Web, plus graph theory, plus digital library. What was that? Larry Page? That help? Terry Winograd? How about Sergey Brin? It's called Google. It's the same thing as Brunelleschi's dome in some ways. So how do you actually do it? It starts with curiosity. It goes on to collection and curation. And that's a feedback process. And that then leads to more creation, which leads to more curiosity, and on it goes. I think there's 6 steps. There's gathering data, which is very important, and we're learning a lot about that these days. There's creating lists. I'm a huge fan of making lists, very, very long lists. and then condensing these lists into ontologies. It's quite an art. Some of it can be done by AI these days, by the way, and it's something we ought to look at. Organizing these lists into categories, naming the categories. Naming is an incredibly important aspect of creativity, because if you don't have a name for it, calling it 27046 won't do it. You need to have an actual name for it that people can use in their own ontologies. And then structuring the categories and comparing the categories and going on from there. So it's all about narrative generation and revision over time. I think it's a process we can actually do something about. In fact, I think there's 4 stages. There's the observation stage, a reflection stage, a conversation stage, and an assembly stage. Observation and reflection are individual attributes. Conversation and assembly are social attributes. So it's a process that involves all of us individually and collectively. The observation stage has a number of parts to it. You'll have copies of these, those who wish copies, so you can see these things. And so does reflection. Reflection can occur at night, and I'll talk about that. Night means early in the morning. I'll give you a couple of words in just a second on this. But it's the restructuring of the data that is the point of reflection. And then there's sleep as a part of this. This is hypnos, which is the Greek word for sleep. And there's 2 words that I happen to like. One is called hypnagogic, and that's people who have creative ideas as they are falling asleep. Dali was famous for being hypnagogic. There's also hypnopompic, and these are people who have their ideas when they wake up in the morning. I am one of those. I've never had an idea that's not at 4 o'clock in the morning, and my wife can attest to that. So can my first wife, but that's a whole other story. So we know quite a bit about how the brain thinks and these days, and you know more about it by far than I do. But there are some experiments that were done in Germany about 10 years ago now. They gave people algorithms, and there was a hidden algorithm inside it. So if you could figure out the hidden algorithm, you could solve the problem in 1/10 of the time that it would take you if you worked it through in a standard way. They trained people in the morning, and they gave them the test in the afternoon. In that case, about 25% of the people found the hidden algorithm. Then they trained people in the afternoon, and they gave them the test at night, in which case 26% found the hidden algorithm. Then they trained people at night, gave them the test in the morning, and 60% found the algorithm. That's a huge difference, right? So to waste the sleeping time is just a huge waste, and we need to learn how to use that time. Don't waste that time. So then there's conversation. I ran a program for the National Academies for years called the National Academies Keck Futures Initiative. And one of our first conversations was a conversation about cells and cell phones. Now, the word cell obviously means something entirely different in those cases, but it was enough to trigger associations in each part. And it was a very productive set of meetings. And obviously, it iterates back and forth. And finally, assembly, building these associations into networks, classifying and categorizing, naming them, selecting and revising. So these are the steps in the creative process. And at the end, you end up with a partially completed creative work. I think these creative embers burn deep into the night. Franklin did bifocals at the age of 76. Verdi did Falstaff at 80. Michelangelo did this Pauline Chapels at 89, and Frank Lloyd Wright did the Guggenheim at 91. So young people's game for sure, not only though, at least in my view. So I call these 4 stages: observation, reflection, conversation, and assembly, Orca, because I can remember Orca, and jumping out of the water kind of sounds right. This guy is very good at this, and he's done all kinds of things that you know about better than I do. I worked with one of his associates at one point named Bobby Niger. And I said to Bobby, he was frustrated that we wasn't coming up with great career-bending opportunities. And I said, Bobby, by 3 days from now, you have to come up with 100 ideas. I want 100 ideas. He said, oh, I can't do 100, I can do 10. I said, I don't want 10, I want 100 ideas. So he came back, per our conversation on Friday, he asked me to send you 100 ideas by yesterday. Yesterday is the clue, right? So he's already late. So far, I only have 11. I'm struggling in coming up with additional ones. But I'm still determined to complete this exercise. Next day, he came back. Since I sent that email a few hours ago, I gained 13 new ideas. I think I'm going in the right direction, so I'm going to keep at it. attached are 103 ideas. Then he came up with it just a little bit later. The brainstorming began slow, but the ideas started pouring, sometimes at the rate of a dozen an hour. As I was coming up with ideas, my mind already started formulating an ontology without me actually physically creating one. And then he went on to talk about the aspects of this. He is a fairly typical fellow. You can increase your own creativity. You can encourage your students to be more creative. And there is a structure, not a process, but a structure for doing that. So that's Orca, to associate previously unassociated fields. As James said, it's the highest order of minds. And Csikszentmihalyi said, creativity is a primary measure of our humanity. And I absolutely believe that's true. Creativity is not an analysis. It's a way of living. So, back to the beginning, a brief history of the mostly Western concept of creativity. Do you know what was creative about who knows who painted this picture? It was Manet. And what was creative about this picture? That's what's creative. Who is that? That's Manet. And how can you interpret this? Because you see the girl and you see her reflection, but you don't see Manet's reflection. But he's in the picture. And where is he in the picture? He's out here. He's not there. He's out here. The act of creation. Thank you very much. Yeah, happy to take any questions. None, that's pretty good. Right, yes, sir. Oh, the bill, yeah, sorry, I didn't see you up there in the light.
You mentioned AI about 6 times.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether you think it will disembody this process from human beings or amplify it by 1,000-fold.
Amplified by 1,000-fold. I don't think there's a chance it will disembody anything. I think it'll push us to a higher level. I organized a meeting for the National Academies last year in Washington, which was called Intelligence: Real and Artificial. And we compared neuroscience with AI. And it was a really interesting 24-hour meeting. And we had the neuroscientists and the AI people in the room. And I think everybody would have the point of view that I had. That we're just at the very beginning of this. This will go on for a very long way. But for AI, there's always a level above. And until we convince ourselves that AI is going to get ahead of us on the level above, you know, we humans are recursive systems and reflexive systems. So we observe what we are observing. To some extent, AI can do that. Whether it can do it as well as we can over time, I think is not at all clear. I happen to believe that we will always stay a step ahead. Is it going to change the way we live our life? Absolutely, without question, right? But whether in the end it supplants human thinking, I'm a personal skeptic. There may be other views. Yes, sir.
So the way I define creativity is the ability to come up with original ideas and apply them. So the example that you showed where you asked Bobby to come up with 100 different ideas, I was wondering like how relevant was that example? Because I mean, the difficulty doesn't fall within coming up with ideas, but with actual like ideas that deliver value.
Yeah. Yeah, so very, very good question. I think it is very relevant because so having taught a bunch of students over the years, they just throw up their hands and say, I can't be creative. And my answer to that is no, that's not correct. You can be creative. And here is a process that you can get started on. Is it the best process? Maybe not. I don't know a better one, but it's the best process I know of. And will it be productive? Yes, it will be productive. I guarantee you. If you ask them to come up with 1 or 2 ideas, there's no possibility that they're going to do that. They have to be pushed beyond their limit. We have to be pushed beyond our limits. And how many of those 100, 200, 500 ideas are going to be the breakthrough ideas? Probably a very small percentage, but it's better than 0, right? So yes, I think it's very relevant. Yes, sir.
You showed a picture of Ben Franklin, and I think Jefferson was next to him.
Yep.
These guys could rightly call themselves Renaissance men at the
Yep.
time. We live in an age when there's so much information, it's really hard to know it all, okay? So the question is what does that do to the creative process? Can you really make the big leaps if you had to focus on biosciences and you can't have that other piece, for example?
Interesting question. My answer for that question, as opposed to the answer to that question, is I think there's never been a better time. But you do have to do some fairly non-standard things. So when I did my PhD at Yale, which I often say is like getting your English degree at MIT. So so, you know, I didn't learn, I learned something, but I didn't learn all that I needed to learn there. And in fact, I've learned it over my life. Would I like to restructure the way education is given? You betcha, right? Would I like to restructure undergraduate curricula? You betcha. Would I like to restructure graduate school curricula? You betcha, right? Would I like to restructure the meaning of some of the degrees? You betcha. I'd like to do, because we know so much more now. And why can't we have, teach the discipline of associating previously unassociated fields, as opposed to going in depth? I'm not trying to get rid of that one, but I'm trying to augment it with another one. So I think it's an absolutely great time to do this. I know a lot of people in their 20s who have had very substantially creative ideas at a very early stage in their career. But that doesn't mean they understand the broader context. And I think it's very important for them to understand that broader context. I spend a lot of time in China. The way they think in China is different from the way we think here. It is a super productive way, and so is our way a super productive way, but it's not the same. So there are different ways of doing this. And I think it's, for me, MIT should have a serious course, not a Saturday afternoon lecture, but a serious course on improving people's creative skills. Maybe it's, you know, it's writing skills. I mean, I certainly never knew how to write until I got to McKinsey, and then they just beat the daylights out of me until I finally learned. I think that can be done here too. And I think we should all have mentors that press us to be more creative than they are. Why, is that the best you can do? Why, think about this, this, and this. I mean, you can generate those kinds of things very fast. So I think we know enough about this now that we can actually push it forward and push our colleagues to our collective benefit to be more creative. Yes, go back up there.
Related to the last question, for those of us who are parents or grandparents, can you take your thoughts and push them into the current educational process a bit, because the national system will be too late for even kids who are 3 to 18 right now.
Yep.
What can parents, grandparents do with, say, grandchildren, you know, K through 12,
Yep.
now to get into some of the structures of your books, and other thoughts of people who want to even do homeschooling as a supplement to the inadequate stuff we get in public schools?
It's a super good question, and one that I'm super unqualified to answer. But I'm a grandparent. I have 3 sons and 3 grandsons. I guess I'm a special of some sort. My grandsons, I'm not pressing them hard to be super creative right now. I want them to learn. I want them to count. I want them to spell. I want them to create sentences. I want them to do those basic things and not push them right now to be the young Picasso or something like that. I think that will come later on. And then would I change high school curriculum? Absolutely, I would, just in the way we just talked. Would I change college curriculum? I would redesign college curriculum. There's no question if I had a chance to do that. Yes.
As you've been looking into the history of creativity, what have you changed your mind about?
Everything. No, it's so I started out on this journey because I didn't know. And I heard a lot of people that were quite glib about it. And none of them did it for me. So I started looking at this thing, and I stumbled on this Webster fact. It's 1875. Are you kidding me? 1875? I mean, that's like yesterday, right? Why doesn't this thing go back 5,000, 7,000 years? Creativity in other languages? Yeah. So I have not looked in other languages? Yeah, I think it would be. I mean, you can't look at Machiavelli and Michelangelo and Leonardo and not wonder what a language. Yeah, I'm sure that some languages facilitated and some languages impeded. There's no question. Yeah, it would be a very interesting study. Yes, sir, way in the back.
Is there any way to quantify creativity? And do you think that throughout the history there were some times that you think that humankind might have been more creative than in the other times?
Yeah, so as far as quantification is concerned, there's no way that I know nor am I particularly concerned about it, by the way. Now, if I wanted to do creativity research, I'd have to have a definition so somebody could find it. But I've been wrestling hard enough to figure out what it is, and then measuring is a good idea. I can measure Bobby Nijar's creative output. I can do that. But whether I could do it on a standardized way that would be useful, I've actually never tried to think about that. So I think that's an interesting question for research. But there's a lot of interesting research questions here. What was the second part of your question?
Times that humankind was more creative than
Oh, for sure, that's true. You get in times when the world goes into recession, and then it goes away. And then when we come back, it explodes. So if you look at the American economy after World War II, there was a lot of creativity in World War II, of course, on the military side. But after that, it just exploded on the civilian side. It does, depends on what you mean by this. Does it affect artistic creativity? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know enough about it. But does it affect economic creativity? I think a lot. Because when you get in periods where the return on equity is multiples of what the return for debt is, then you get a lot of company formation, and there's a lot of creative ideas. I think there's also a lot of junk in that, by the way. So, and when you get to the time when debt returns are way in excess of equity returns, then the real entrepreneurs come out. They have this idea, they can't sleep, they can't do anything else other than produce this idea. Then you get some really good ideas out of that. So there's some cycles in here which haven't been adequately explored in my mind, but I think they are very important, and there are correlations, I think.
if you think that there are some extrinsic factors for shaping the creativity, something like creative environment, what would you say that the creative environment is?
Well, I think I'd start right in this room, to be honest with you. This is a pretty creative place, and it always has been a creative place for a very long time. Place next door isn't so bad either. In fact, this whole community, as I said, I spent a lot of time up here in the 90s, and I've been back once or twice, but this is the longest visit I've had for quite some time. I'm just stunned by what I've seen here. And to think that this isn't just exploding creativity in this environment, much more so in my view than Palo Alto, by the way, for whatever it's worth. Yeah, I think there's a lot you can do about it. I think if we think we have a structure of what it looks like, and you can argue with my definition, I don't have a problem with that, but the structure of the argument I think is important. Do we have definitions? Can we challenge people to do things? Are they going to be, what's the chance that we're going to hurt somebody by giving them these exercises? I think that's zero, right? So I would encourage everybody to do this. And some people will take to it and some people won't. So, yes.
I'm curious about a slide that you had, narrative generation and revision, in which you laid out a process that was linear. And I'd love to hear any thoughts about anything that you were thinking about what overlaps, what doesn't, is it linear, is it not?
Right.
Because you almost have each stage completing before the next begins.
Right. So this goes back to the lesson that was beat into me at McKinsey on how to communicate, right? This does not go back. This does not go back to my engineering days when I was designing nonlinear partial differential equations, because it's very hard to explain that to someone. It doesn't mean the process is not that way. I hope you saw a lot of feedback cycles in these definitions, and that's the nonlinear portion of it. Of course, it's highly nonlinear. But it's important that people get the basic ideas, and not everybody can be an expert in nonlinear partial differential equations and get it. This whole notion of recursiveness and reflexivity is super important ideas. I don't know whether rats think about what other rats are thinking, and I think there's some evidence that probably they do, but we certainly do. And so that changes everything for us, and we have to take that into account. Jerry, yes.
I want to follow up on the issue of linearity. And for many people that I've talked to, I consider to be creative. They say they get their most creative ideas when they're doing something which is
Yes.
completely not in their field, in my case, fishing. So the question is, how does that fit into this scheme?
So that's why I talked about hypnopompy and hypnagogy and hypnopompy, because that happens to me every morning. I mean, and the iPhone really helped me, because until then I'd turn on the light and write down my ideas, because I knew I could never remember them, right? And that's it led to my second marriage, which is a lot better than the first one, by the way. I'm still having these ideas, but now I put them on my iPhone and everything seems to be fine. But that's where I get them, and they do go completely cross fields. They don't go to fields that I don't know anything about, of course. So I find that the more I know about different fields, and I don't need to know a lot, but I need to know how people think in different fields. I find that stimulates it a lot. So I think this is very important. And I think your points about the apparent linearity, I don't believe linearity at all in this business. These are all jumps. I just don't believe it. But I do want to make it understandable by people. And I don't want to produce a process that's so complex that nobody can understand what it is. So that's the attempt. But I think when we discussed, I discussed that Austrian data about discovering of the hidden algorithm, that I think that is an example. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's an example of these nonlinear processes where people didn't know what they were trying to discover yet they went from 25% who discovered it to 60%, even when they didn't have a clear objective in their mind. Certainly that's what happens to me at 4 o'clock in the morning. And most of the ideas I have at 4 o'clock in the morning are total waste. But every good idea I've had at 4 o'clock in the morning. Yes.
About this near impossible that you mentioned a couple times. So one thing you can look at
The near possible. Near possible.
Near possible.
Not near impossible. Right.
So there are people who are creative. Are they just left out, or do you think there are ways that people can control this art of being mentored to be more at the right area?
Yeah. So I of course believe that there is a distribution, and some people are wildly more creative than others, and that's the way it is. But I think all of us can be more creative than we are, and we have to work at it. And I would include it in college curricula, if and not a Saturday afternoon 1-hour lecture, but I mean a real serious course on pushing people to do these things. And whether it's creativity in mathematics or the arts or literature or science or whatever it is, let them pick. And I think we and the students will be surprised by how effective these things can become. Yes, go over.
So, can you speak a little bit about individual versus group creativity? I mean, lots of the things that you mentioned was sort of the previous generation, but nowadays we work in groups.
Yep. So when I talked about the Orca, observation, reflection, conversation, assembly. So the first two, observation, reflection, those are individual. And those will, in my mind, always remain individual. Does it mean that there can't be multiple individuals doing that? No, of course not. There's multiple, but it's something we do. It's at 4 o'clock in the morning, So then the second part is the conversation and assembly. That's an entirely social process. And so to me, the act of creation is a collective process. It's both individual contributions and collective contributions to it. And I think it's helpful to think about it in that way, because otherwise we end up with this burden that, geez, I've got to do the whole thing myself. Well, that's not a good idea, right? You want to have the spark and then go in and be able to talk to your colleagues and talk the idea around. And if they're not interested in the idea, well, that's probably a sign. But often they will be interested, and then you can go. Then the next night, or the night after that, or the night after that, you'll have another idea, and it'll advance it a little bit more, and it'll keep going like that. It's autocatalytic in that sense. Yes, Miss.
So you mentioned ontology multiple times during your talk. I wonder, for those of us who are at the beginning of our careers, what kind of recommendations would you have as far as keeping track of our creativity in terms of accountability? And in what ways could we track it in metrics in terms of if we have an idea, maybe that idea might not be right during that time period, so we might have to pivot in the way that we think, and then maybe save that idea for a later time. Right. How would you recommend?
So I'll tell you what I do, and I use a software called Inspiration. I would doubt that any of you use this software. It's made for students in the 1st and 2nd grades, and it's one of these mind mapping things. I don't use any of that, but there's an outliner behind that. And I use that outliner 3-4 times a day. I'll go take meeting notes and I'll transfer those in there. And then I get a list of 27 points or 30 points or 75 points, right? And then I start organizing those points because this software allows me to organize them very fast. Once I restructure them, then I have to have a name for that group. These 5 things are all the same. What is it? What is the name of that group? And then instead of a list of 75 things, I have 6 lists of 6 things or 7 things or whatever it is with a name. And then I group the groups. And then I have to have a name for that. And then I have an ontology. And I do this every day in every field. And it is incredibly helpful. And I can collapse that outline. I can look at the 3 ideas and how they all fit together. I don't have to look at 100 things. I can't look at 100 things and make any sense out of it. I have to put them into groups. I have to create an ontology. Just like at the American Museum of Natural History. You know, you don't look at all the dinosaur bones at the same time. They're all in different clades, and you have to look at what the clades are. You have to create the clades for your own life. And then you can measure. How many of these outlines have I done? Why haven't I done one in the last month? What's wrong, you know, da, da, da. And then it's up to you to remember what those ideas are so you can use them later. But yeah.
I guess one follow-up question. So when you do that, oftentimes you also identify your pain points. What are good ways as far as like keeping track of your pain points and addressing those in a timely manner to make sure that you are at the height of your creativity versus getting bogged down by things that might allow you to create it?
I don't have a thoughtful answer for that question, but my first thought is I go back to lists. I just start listing these things. And so how many pain points do I have? Do I have 3? That's one thing. Do I have 37? That's another thing. If I have 37, are they really 37 different ones, or are they really in 5 categories? And what can I learn from the higher level category? Sometimes you'll see things at a higher level that make sense and you can address that you can't see at a specific level. So I would do that. Keep an organized diary, I would say. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'd like to circle back to creativity, back to the business process and running of businesses and the aspect of your book, Creative Destruction, and what you may have learned over now the period since then to now, and any different insights that you would apply today versus what you had a view on those at that time.
Yeah, it's a super good question, and I do have some different, some of the beliefs that I had then, I have stronger now. You saw one of them happen the last week. Anybody here from GE? Okay, then I'll make my GE comment. I've been a critic of GE for a long time, as Bill may remember. But then there's another company called Danaher that I have been emphasizing for the last 10 years. Their performance has been way beyond Warren Buffett's, by the way, way beyond Warren Buffett's, and they completely transformed themselves. That's my model, and I think it shows, it's the existence proof. It says this is possible to do. The thing that Danaher has done better than any other, and I did not talk about this in the book, is if you look at the progress of Danaher relative to the economy, it's virtually a straight, if this is the economy, this is Danaher like this. And if you look at most companies, there'll be CEO A, it goes like this, then CEO B goes like this, and CEO C goes like this, and CEO D goes like this. Not Danaher, they're all like this. So they have developed a meta skill for developing their senior leaderships through 6 cycles without ever dropping the ball. That's quite extraordinary. Do I understand fully how they do that? No. Do I want to understand how they fully do it? You betcha. And I'm hoping to get down there in the next, at least start some conversations with them. And the chairman of Danaher is now the new chairman of GE. And there are other big companies that have it. So, and by the way, how does this play out in China versus the United States? It's different in China. Some of this has to do with the capital markets. As I was saying earlier today, take the Shanghai 3000 index and compare it to the Shanghai Shenzhen 300 index. What's the difference? Well, one is the Shanghai Shenzhen has performed way better than the Shanghai Composite. Why? Because the Shanghai Shenzhen gets rid of companies off the bottom. The Shanghai 3000 never gets rid of companies. So they drag all that stuff along, and so they underperform. And it's, if I was, a senior leader in China, I would get on that and do something about it. So I think there are lessons we can learn from all this. You have to, my Uber paradigm is you have to create, operate, and eliminate at the pace and scale of the markets without losing control. So you have to do those 4 things: create, operate, eliminate, which is much harder than creation, by the way, and control. And if you do those 4 things, it's going to, which is very hard, by the way, then it's going to be okay. Yes?
So my question is, very protocol-driven clinical sciences, especially with the junior doctors, very protocolized treatment which is given by the junior doctors to the patients. Where do you see the role of creativity between the interaction of the doctors who are following a protocol and the patients?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think hospitals need to be creative. I think when you're a physician and you're treating a patient, the Hippocratic Oath had it, do no harm, right? But if you don't know what the condition is, then I would start invoking some of these things. And I know enough about how doctors work, but these are very deep and long questions that have to be answered. At a place like Memorial and like Mass General or Dana-Farber up here, they have really good ways of handling this. Got the message, thanks. They're telling me it's the last question. Which probably tells me I should stop right now. But it's really an important set of questions right now for our nation, is to figure out how to deal with these things. I'm happy to make this statement in this room because I'm pretty sure if it's wrong, and I can't believe that it's right, one of you guys will tell me. But I think if you want to go to medical school today, and you want to go to the medical school or a medical school which has a full semester course on the use of digital technology to improve patient care, there are no options. There's not one school that offers a course in how to use digital technology in 2018 to improve the care of patients. That's a disgrace, right? If it's true, it's a disgrace. And so I would start there. Thank you all very much. Yeah.
So, Dick, thank you very much for sharing your insight and for spending the time with us today. I'm sure that all of those who joined us have been intrigued and have had thoughts inspired by Dick. I certainly did. I think this was a fantastic exploration of creativity. And I think I'd like to offer you, Dick, a small token of our appreciation. So I'll give you. And I can see that there is much discussion yet to occur, right? We had to cut off the questions. That's always the best possible sign of an invigorating and thought-provoking presentation. So I hope that all of you will join us just around the corner at a reception in a few minutes. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us here today, and I hope that you will return in the future for other Whitehead Institute events. Thank you very much. Right.